I was in the mechanical engineering program at the University of Texas in Austin. And after a few semesters of calculus and physics and engineering stuff, I kind of realized that these aren't the people who make cars look good. And so luckily I was part of a SAE group, the school club or whatever. And then they brought in people to lecture much like this. And this was a guy who I think was a Mazda engineer. And I asked him, like, who styles cars? Who makes these things look good? It's not engineers. It's not people in this program. And so he basically mentioned, of course, Art Center, and then the school in Detroit, Center for Creative Studies. And so, as luck would have it, the SAE group had like a competition that summer, and it was in Detroit. And so I signed up for that deal, and we went up there for that. And I snuck away one day and went and visited CCS and kind of liked what I saw. You know, Detroit. Is anybody here from Detroit? Good, because it's a dirty, scary place. But it was worth it. I thought the school was going to be a really cool place to go. So I went home, put my portfolio together, and luckily I got in. So that winter, I packed my bags and moved to Detroit, Michigan. And that's where I met Max. Max was there. He had a van with no windows and a couch in the back, which sounds pretty creepy, but he was okay. He had a Corvair. So anyway, school was a lot of fun. You know, it was a very hard program. What did I want to say? I'm losing it. I got to do, you know, they kind of separate. They have a transportation program that they separate from their industrial design program. I got accepted into the trans program. I got an internship out here at Calty in Newport Beach, and that was a great opportunity. And then upon graduating, well, let me just show you some of my senior stuff. So the first one is kind of like a third world little commuter car. It's all based around motorcycle technology, just because I was kind of into bikes back then and all kinds of stuff. And I really enjoyed the model making process. So this is a clay model. It's all hand. I don't know if anybody still does that anymore at the school level, but so clay model, you know, vacuum formed wheels and lots of little foam pieces. And this is basically the structure I envisioned. So it's kind of built like a sport bike where you'd have an aluminum frame and then plastic panels that went all around it, and then a little V-twin motor or V4 or whatever in the middle that kind of went between the two front passengers. And this drawing originally was probably, I don't know, it was maybe 3 feet wide. So this was all done in pencil in one long night to get ready for my senior presentation. This was a bike that was probably about this big. That's all handmade model out of foam. And this was sponsored by Honda. The Honda out here in Torrance or somewhere out here. And so that was a fun project. It was kind of a short mid-semester thing, but that was part of my whole senior presentation. And this was my first attempt at 3D modeling. You know, things were a lot different back then. This was, you know, you guys now have SolidWorks and much more sophisticated and easier to learn modeling, but this was an airplane I kind of came up with to look like some old World War II fighter that could have existed but didn't. You can see my initials there, and the little number on the wing just happened to be the Detroit area code, or the zip code. And then I did this Photoshop thing with Howard Hughes standing next to it, and I had this whole fake story about how he developed this thing, and before jet technology came about, and that this was going to win the war. And then I knew I had done something right when somebody was looking at my board, and they said, "Why do you have this plane up here? You know, it's just, this is for your design stuff." It's like, yeah. And then they realized that I'd built that. That was a digital model. He thought it was a photograph. So after this, luckily I received a job offer from General Motors. And I started, well, you know, that reminds me of a story. There was another guy that got hired at the same time I did. His name's Scott. And Scott was kind of a wake and bake stoner dude. And once he realized that GM did a drug test to get hired, you know, we kind of investigated that, oh, it's a hair test. So old Scott shaved his entire body. You know, I took his word for it, you know, other than his eyebrows and his head that I could see. And so that's how he escaped the drug test. So, but anyway, we both, Hairless Scott and I, went to this studio called Apex, which was Advanced Portfolio Exploration. And it really wasn't a design studio per se. It was kind of looking at future possibilities that might affect the automotive market, you know, things that we didn't realize, you know, like social media and stuff you have in your car now. You know, those were the things we were trying to predict. We didn't predict any of those, but you know, it's just autonomous cars and things like that. And then we both got moved to the Chevy truck studio. And their goal, or at least the project that was presented to us, was to come up with some kind of Chevy, like Wrangler fighter, like a Chevy Jeep. And it was codenamed the Chunk. And so these are some of my initial sketches for this Chevy Chunk thing. And this went on, we probably had maybe a month or two of work into it. And then General Motors signed some kind of agreement with AM General to use the Hummer name. So this whole project got dropped, and then this must have been late, mid-1999. So GM got the Hummer name, and they wanted to build a Hummer concept vehicle. But we only had a few months because the Detroit Auto Show was beginning of January. So we all got pushed in some off-site studio, and this went away, and we started on the Hummer H2. And this is some of the images from the press kit. That was a pretty exciting project. I mean, it was like round the clock, trying to figure it all out. I did this logo, the H2, and I think that's probably the only thing that I ever got into production at my time at GM. And so this was one of the initial sketches. Again, I just found these out of the press book, and just quick gestural things. And then we worked on the exterior. I mainly did the interior stuff, but we were all kind of helping each other out. You know, it wasn't a very defined team at that point. It was maybe 4 or 5 guys trying to build a functional concept vehicle in 3 months. So it went to a full-size clay model. You can see the little dots on there. That's how they used to digitize it to build the kind of cloud data. Then they'd build a model 3D model over that. And they actually built stamping dies, and they stamped this thing out of steel. It wasn't very straight steel, so it's full of Bondo, but this is the running initial concept. So this is the concept vehicle. It's a lot different. Well, if you notice the subtleties, it's a lot different than the production Hummer H2, which was basically a Tahoe, a rebodied Tahoe. Here's one of the initial interior sketches. You know, I did all this crazy Star Wars-y stuff, you know, seats and, you know, shifters that are reminiscent of an aircraft throttle, you know, gauges that look like little radar screens. And, you know, they just said, go to town, be crazy, and, you know, see what the executives chose. And that's one of my sketches there that was kind of based off of the final model. And this was the interior. The sketch to the right, to the right, that was one of the drawings. I kind of hoped it would be that way, but in reality, with time frames and stuff, it ended up that one on the left. That steering wheel is a solid chunk of aluminum, just full billet. So it had a tilt lever on there, and if you hit the tilt lever, it would bruise your thighs. The wheel would just drop. And so it's funny to watch people do that when they got in there to play with it. And here's another sketch, or not sketch, but pictures of the interior. It basically had regular truck seats that were available then. I mean, it was a very rushed through project, but nonetheless, it was something I was proud of. I got to be part of a concept vehicle. You know, it was exciting. They did this press release in 2000, which probably had, I don't know, close to a dozen cars. Like every brand had a concept vehicle for the year 2000. And at that time, GM probably had at least 7 brands or so. But you could see, like in the middle, the initial radio was like a radar screen, and that got swapped out for their current head unit. That was their production head unit at the time. So that was great. After that, I got moved into the minivan studio, of all places, and worked on minivans for Saturn and Pontiac, you know, neither of which exist anymore. And, you know, it was not nearly as exciting. You know, this was right around the time, you know, 9/11 had happened. I'd been in Detroit for, I don't know, close to 11 years at that point. And I was just kind of miserable and not having fun. I was really, you know, I had been tinkering with cars on the side this whole time, and, you know, I looked to guys like Chip Foose and Tom Taylor and Steve Stanford and all these guys that were doing hot rod design. So, so I quit and did what anybody else would do. I moved to Wyoming. But I had a game plan. There's a school there called Wyotech, which taught hot rod fabrication and welding and metal shaping and all these things that I wanted to learn. I knew, you know, I was a young, single guy. I knew if I didn't do it then, I never would. So I moved to Wyoming, enrolled in their program. And it was fun. I learned a lot. You know, once they kind of figured out there was a GM designer guy there, you know, they approached me and they wanted me to help develop a hot rod design program. And so I was offered a job basically as a hot rod instructor after I finished their program, but with the intentions of starting this hot rod design thing. So in the meantime, they were introducing me to a lot of shops in the industry, because that's where people would come there to hire students to work in their hot rod shops. So I was doing a lot of freelance work. They also got me involved in there's a TV show, Overhauling, that one of the episodes they got was in conjunction with Wyotech, and they filmed it out in Wyoming. And so I was lucky enough to be part of that, and got to spend time with Chip, and as well as a lot of other hot rod guys. So this is just some of the freelance drawing stuff I would do. Just a little crazy little roadster. None of these, well, maybe that one on the lower left got built to a certain extent. The other two were just, I think they were just artwork for people and didn't really turn into a real car. But let's see, here's a few more drawings. These are all for clients, except for the one on the left. That was kind of a SEMA proposal that I never proposed. But I thought it was a neat drawing. I was going to try to get a free van. But there's a lot to that, to get a free car given to you. So basically, this is kind of what kept me going for a while, was just doing renderings for different shops that would produce these vehicles. And one of the shops that I was doing work for was a shop in Colorado. It was about an hour south of where I was at. And they approached me they wanted to do a crazy little roadster pickup. It had a big budget, and it was going to be something wild. And so they wanted me to come up with some ideas. So I threw together some sketches. Basically, the idea was to be a rat rod proportionally. And this is when the rat rod craze was big, bigger. It's like probably 2003 or so. So I did some rough sketches, and I just kind of, like the interior stuff, I was like, why don't we just do some like hardwood floors, like a Chris Craft boat. This was kind of a, all back in the days when street rods were very slick, no exposed fasteners. This one was the opposite. It had exposed everything. Kind of a steampunk interior, but that's before there was steampunk. And so these were the initial sketches. And then kind of developed into this. They wanted to, the owner came up with this name Loaded, so I did a logo for it. So it has multiple connotations, I guess. But that was probably close to the finished drawing. The wheel design, so again, something crazy. It was kind of based off an old 30s wide 5, or like these big industrial trailers. They have these wide 5 lug pattern, and so they said yes to pretty much most of it, which was great. I finally had a chance to design something that wasn't just the exterior shell. To me, this was like real design versus styling. I got to design the suspension, all the the way the throttle pedal worked, and the rear suspension links, and all the little nuts and bolts. I mean, it was pretty much from the bottom to the top, trying to make everything not only look good, but actually function. And so that's the tachometer. It was an old tach out of a World War II aircraft that was modified for normal RPM of a street motor. The speedometer was actually, it's like, why don't we just put it in a headlight bucket and then bolt it to the transmission tunnel? And so, that was the sketch for that. And little things like, the way the windshield would pop open. These old cars, the windshield would swing out as kind of a ventilation system, even though this thing didn't have a roof or anything. But it still needs neat little details, and then an air cleaner. And here's young Christian actually learning to build a car that he was designing. So it's kind of funny to dig up these old pictures and see myself. But that one is basically the finished car before it went to paint. You know, there's a few more details to add, but at that point, we basically took it and did a bare metal photo shoot. So that's pretty much all the stuff in bare metal. You know, you can see the hardwood floor, you know, the gauges, and you know, luckily I was working with some very talented craftsmen, you know, to get these things, you know, fabricated super straight, and lots of attention to detail. That trunk in the back, it kind of happened by accident. You know, the guy that veneered the floor, the wood floor, he was a furniture guy, and so he knew how to like wrap things with hammered copper or just, you know, kind of a decorative thing. So we built this box in the back, which was for storage, but yet it had all the electrical system in it. They suggested wrapping it with hammered copper, and so they kind of gave it a unique look, you know, a little bit of a patina. There's a front view of it. And so everybody was pretty happy. It was you know, the wheels came out fine. Those were machined locally in Colorado. And here is the finished car, kind of a root beer color. And that went on to become the 2005 Street Rod of the Year, the Good Guys Street Rod of the Year, if you're familiar with that. So it got a lot of press. It had magazines all around the world. And, you know, I was really proud of it. It was my first real hot rod. And to this day, when I get introduced to people, they usually introduce me as, oh, this is the guy that designed Loaded. So that's pretty cool. And there's the engine after it's all finished out. It's basically a 270 Dodge Hemi, if that means anything to anybody. What you see there for the exhaust was the exhaust. So this thing was so loud that, you know, it was an attention getter. It wasn't really designed to drive on the street. So it never really got driven. I don't think it ever had a license plate put on it. But a lot of these high-end cars didn't. And here's the finished interior. So lots of leather, but yet still simple. You know, the door panels really didn't have any real stuff on them. You know, it had this loop that was a handle, and then it turned into what's called a check strap, which keeps the door from opening too far. And, you know, there's little storage compartment in the armrest. The key was hidden up under the speedometer, and you know, and this really kind of freaked people out. Nobody had seen an interior that had, you know, exposed fasteners everywhere, as well as, you know, wood floor is enough for most people, but, you know, no dashboard per se. You know, you've just got gauges just floating out in space. So, and here was one of the wheel sketches. And so that's kind of how it worked, but, you know, the wheels they turned out pretty well also. And here's the front of it. So after this was done, you know, there really wasn't anything left for me to do there. That project was over. They didn't have any more high-end or any big design-intensive projects coming up. And I was, you know, still doing design work for other shops, and so I was offered an opportunity to move out to Northern California, to Santa Rosa, and so I went out there. I'd been doing more motorcycle things at this point, just for various people and for myself. And so here's a few bike sketches. The one in the upper right-hand corner, it got built. And this was kind of in the height of this, I don't know if you remember, there was like Discovery Channel biker build-off and Jesse James stuff. And so this is kind of in the height of that, mid-2000s. I sketched out that one, the one on the lower left, you know, I just drew it out. I didn't really have a game plan in mind, but I just thought it had a neat look. So it was just a pure sketch with no real engineering or geometry figured out. You can see in the drawing, I just kind of threw some lines in there where there's should be like real stuff. But I think I could pull this off. So I did some more research and looked, you know, throughout, you know, just on the internet and wherever I could find stuff. And people have done, they call it a hub steer front end, where instead of normal forks like a bicycle or a motorcycle might have, it's basically just an arm that holds your pivot. And the geometry is pretty basic. You know, to make a bicycle or a motorcycle handle and go in a straight line, there's only a few criteria that you need to figure out. And so I gave it a shot. So this is how I started, basically. You know, I built a frame fixture and bent some tubes, and you know, the trick is to get it square and all this stuff about that's really an engineering thing more than a design thing. A lot of this, the design was, you know, you had to do one part, then work your way to the next, just because now you're not just designing something, you're designing 1,000 things. And so as I figured it out, that's more of the front end coming together. You know, I figured out the steering and how the wheel would work and wheel bearings and all of the mechanics involved. I basically came up with, just to keep my head from exploding, a vocabulary. You know, I said, well, anything that's going to be a tube is going to have this little flared end on it with a rounded end. So like handlebars and foot pegs and any little things like that would have that. Flat parts that kind of connected the dots, you know, I would drill out and usually have some kind of swoopy line. And so it kind of gave, there's just some cohesion throughout the bike from end to end, like every part would either have these elements so that it just held together from front to rear. And this is basically the completed bike in bare metal. I skipped a lot of the stuff just because I don't know how much welding and sheet metal pictures you want to see. But that's basically the finished bike in bare metal. I rode it around, made sure it all worked, and luckily, you know, after a year's worth of labor, everything, you know, functioned as it should, you know, for a 10-foot long chopper. So, and here's a picture of the other side. But basically lots of handwork. And it's a leaf spring. Yeah, that's, well, thank you. Pretty much every part, mechanical part of this thing, you know, I kept like a vintage technology. So the spring is a leaf spring. The, you know, spoked wheels, the drum brake, that thing under the leaf spring, which is like the little circle with, that is called a friction shock. So before they had tubular hydraulic shocks like modern cars have, they had this kind of two plates with this material in between, and you just keep tightening it up till it gets stiff enough, and then that stops all the bounce. And so that was like 1920s technology. And so with that and the kickstart and you know, this magneto ignition, it was all old technology. So everything I did on this bike, even if it looks crazy and weird, it was all could have been done, you know, in 1945 if somebody was crazy enough to do it. Even the steering mechanism, that was all piece of axle out from I think it was like a 40 Ford. So all the spindle, everything, the steering mechanism is all vintage technology. Strangely enough, there weren't really any old parts on this bike. I mean, the engine was a reproduction of what was called a panhead, but it wasn't, there weren't any old parts on it. It was all new castings and new stuff. The front wheel hub, I think, is the only old part that was off of like a, I don't know what year, mid-60s Harley Sportster. And here it is painted. So it was the same thing with the paint job. It was meant to be reminiscent of like a 40s Ford color. This was actually like a Honda Element paint, you know, for a 2005 Honda Element, which was a weird little square box car. But that was the closest thing we had to like this khaki tan color back then. You know, blacked out the wheels and did this orange pinstripe. So it really gave it the, you know, kind of held with the vintage technology and all that stuff. And then here's a picture of me riding the thing. And so, luckily, it did well. I mean, it freaked people out, but I took it to the Pomona, to the Grand National Roadster Show. It won America's Most Beautiful Motorcycle that year, which I was pretty proud of. And then it got toured to Sturgis and various other events around the country. It was on the Easy Riders Centerfold Tour, which is, it was fun, but I didn't really fit into the biker crowd. You know, I didn't have any flames or leather vests or anything. But I did get a lot of exposure. And so after that, just to keep the momentum going, I decided to try another bike. This one, I ended up with this engine. It was actually a company out in Riverside here makes these reproduction flathead Indian motors. And so I got one of their motors. And so this bike, the idea was basically just to work around this engine. I didn't have a real game plan other than some gestural lines to kind of get this arc over the top, and then thought about, you know, some of these design elements. I've kind of was attempting to establish a style. So again, I stuck with the leaf springs, which you'll see in some other pictures, but it actually has a leaf spring in the front and the rear. So there's the one on the rear as I was building the rear swing arm. And the one in the front goes over the front tire, which is something that Indian motorcycles used to use back in the 30s. So I kind of took some of their heritage and twisted it a little bit. This bike actually was more labor intensive than the other one, even though it's probably, you know, it's a much more normal silhouette and style of bike. But the tubing on it, it had a lot more tapered tubing, like the swing arm and the fork legs and all over the bike. The round elements would go from thick to thin. So if I have a little bracket with an arm or things that, little arms that held up the seat, I would machine tapered bar stock, and then I would heat and bend it to shape. And a lot of people don't notice that, but it took forever to do that. And here it is painted. I did it all just black, solid black. And so you can kind of see the lines, how I really, just wanted to connect the dots to make it flow from end to end. That little chain-driven alternator, that was from a Kubota lawn tractor, I believe. And so I rigged that up and then machined this sleeve on the other side of it that housed all the electronic guts that were just something, they were too ugly to they needed to be hidden somewhere. And so that is the Indian. This was actually photographed here in Long Beach. And you can see like the tank, that plate over the top of the tank, that was 3/8 of an inch thick aluminum. And I shaped it with a crown, which was pretty brutal. Luckily I had access to some big power hammer equipment, and I could actually shape something that thick, even though my wrists were numb for days. But it went on. It did well too. It went on to get 2009 America's Most Beautiful Motorcycle. Same thing. It went on to Sturgis and all these other shows and art galleries. Something I forgot to mention with that other bike, it got invited to be on display at the Clinton Library in Arkansas. So that was kind of neat to be in this exhibit called Art of the Chopper. And here's one last photo. Well, not quite the last photo of that. This was taken up in the Hollywood Hills by the photographer's suggestion. So I just thought that was a nice shot. You can see the level of detail. And there's a better shot of that engine. And so this was, 2009 or so. I decided that it was time I needed to go home. I had been in California a while now, and so I moved back to Texas. My parents were getting older, they needed help, and I was just ready to go to a place where I could actually afford some property. So I moved back home and bought a shop, a building, and things were going well. I continued to do freelance work. I could pretty much do that from anywhere, and I was making products, not really products, but people would call me to build, like they'd see certain components on this bike or the other bike, and they would want me to build something similar to that, so I'd build things for them. I'd build a lot of gas tanks for people, and yet still designing. I started doing work for another shop down near Austin, which is basically a car collector guy who, kind of a Jay Leno type situation where the guy built his own facility, had a huge collection of cars, and then basically started his own hot rod shop. He mainly worked on his cars, but also took in customer work. And one of the customer jobs was a guy that wanted to take an attempt at what's called the Riddler Award. I don't know if you guys have heard of that, but it's basically kind of like the Super Bowl of hot rod building. So this is the car that we ended up with. It's a '39 Oldsmobile. It started out at another shop, and then came to us, and we pretty much had to redo everything. It was a mess. And basically a hand-built car, and like the bumpers. It had kind of the theme, the visual theme, you know, if I create these form vocabularies just for myself, was this kind of, I called it the St. Louis Arch, which was just a big, really the shape of the hood. And so that gets repeated throughout the vehicle several times. And that's kind of what gave me a kind of a recipe when I started doing each component for this thing. Here's a few other shots of it. And so this would be intake manifold. We had custom machined out of one big block of aluminum. You know, it kind of carries that same theme with the whole St. Louis Arch. But you can see the air cleaners and all that stuff that were fabricated. Pretty much the whole front end of that car was just made from scratch. And then that's the finished engine with all the paintwork. And it was an Oldsmobile engine in an Oldsmobile, not, you know, car guys, that might be important. But all hand fabricated. Here's one of the wheels, the back wheel. And again, like the spokes, were all meant to be these kind of fingernail shaped little arches. And that little insignia in the middle, like a Rolls Royce, it would stay put. It was on a bearing and it had a weight behind it, so that as the car rolled, the little emblem always stayed upright. And so here's a picture of it painted. A little better shot of like how the wheels and everything look. This is kind of a filtered picture, so it's not really the paint color. That's probably closer to the real paint color, kind of this gray. But that was a fun project. I mean, it was extremely high budget. And here is the interior. And so you can see the arch thing repeated throughout the interior. The steering wheel is basically one of the car wheels if you look in the center. And so they all kind of relate to each other. You know, even the pedals and the AC vents, all that stuff was all thought about with the, you know, having a relationship in mind. Here's the center, the gauges. That was all machined from big blocks of aluminum. And again, you know, all the shapes, all reminiscent of the other shapes. You know, even down here, these little switches on either side of that vent, those were 3D printed stainless steel, which that was our first experiment into that, and it worked out well. It polished it out. It looked just like it was a machined or cast part. And here's some of the development stuff. You know, I haven't had the luxury of learning 3D modeling like you guys probably have, so I would sketch things out on paper, just old school style, pass it off to, in this case, it was the gauge manufacturer that built this model. And then just do lots of back and forth revisions until they basically got what I was, you know, or at least close enough to what I had in mind. And so that was basically it. That car did win the Riddler in 2016, so it accomplished its goal. And it did the same thing. It got toured all over the country. The next project's probably more, this is probably closer to how things, what we normally do. You know, it's pretty, you know, it's full custom, but nothing too wild. And this is a 1940 Ford truck. It was a fun project. And it had kind of the design idea with the interior and stuff was this Art Deco kind of waterfall treatment. So you can see I did that in the door panels, and there's this box in the back, which I called the baby coffin because it looked like a coffin. It was something, the owner wanted this storage compartment back there, and he wanted this big industrial box like that, you know, you see in commercial trucks, but he wanted it all dolled up to look like an old shipping container or shipping trunk, and so that's what it is. But the buckles all have the little deco waterfall, and then the seat has like the same thing. You know, you can see that these sketches are pretty rough. That's, you know, when you're working in-house, you've got your upholstery guy and your paint guys and all this stuff together. You know, a lot of this stuff happens on the fly. It's not really something meant for presentation, but it had to be good enough to get the idea across. But that's the seat of that truck. If there's a particular product I'd say I've designed, it's probably wheels. I've done a ton of wheels. But same thing, I'm not the one modeling them, which I wish I was, and hopefully will be soon. But I would do basically a design sketch, you know, then hand that all over to the wheel manufacturer who had their own modelers. They would do their version of it, and then I would do revisions, and then we would cut the wheel. There'd usually be no modeling. I mean, you know, there wouldn't be any test runs on foam or anything. So I would, it's been pretty scary because these wheels aren't cheap. You know, they start from these huge, expensive blocks of aluminum with lots of machine time. And so usually every time one shows up, you know, after I've had 15 minutes to draw one out and then go back and forth with a few revisions and then they make the wheels, I'm always relieved when everybody's happy with them and that they actually fit the car. And here's another one. This is actually turned out pretty cool. But again, you can just, they start as raw, quick sketches passed on to modelers. And there's the wheels. And here's one more. And this wheel was like a 57 Oldsmobile, something like that. But really, it was the stock hubcap, just enlarged, and I filled in the gaps with the, you know, little bumps, just some design elements that fit that kind of 50s theme. And there's the finished wheel in the car. And that's basically all the show and tell stuff I brought. I guess I'd be glad to answer any questions if anybody has any. Anybody?
Can you talk a little bit more about what inspires you on some of, like, on this one particularly, like the language that you start to create and the vocabulary, as you call it? With some cars, you have a particular element that's already part of the vehicle. But when you're doing something new, where does that come from, or where do you look for inspiration, or?
That's, you know, I guess it could come from different places. You know, in this case, I probably, you know, maybe it's so hard to remember. I probably made the handlebars and just did that as a cool way to end it. If I could go back, both of these bikes, instead of like using normal, there's not a good picture of it. Instead of using a normal hand grip, like you would see on a, you know, bicycle or a motorcycle, whatever, that's a rubber sleeve. These were done the way they used to do like golf clubs and tennis rackets back in the old days. They would basically wrap string around the handle and use like a shellac or a glue that would harden up, and then that created your kind of grippy surface. And so both of these bikes were done that way, and so I knew like the end of the handlebars would be exposed and the end of the foot pegs and all that stuff. So that's why I wanted to make those ends of the handlebars or pegs stand out and actually be a design element. And so once I found something I like, then I would repeat it, you know. So whatever I came up with first kind of set the mark, and that helped me kind of repeat it throughout all these components.
What do you think the role of the craftsman or the fabricator is today, particularly you know, with the accessibility of all these rapid prototyping techniques and equipment? Is there a role of that fabricator outside of the custom industry?
That's a good question. You know, I would think so. It really depends on the material that you're using. If it's, and then how much, you know, if you're trying to mass produce an item or not. You know, if it's a piece of furniture that has like shaped wood, you know, it may not be so easy to you know, if it's like bent plywood that's laminated, you know, like you make a skateboard, that I'm not so sure that can be done fully in an automated way just yet. Sheet metal things like these gas tanks or car fenders or whatever, that, you know, unless you're willing to go with a huge investment to stamp out hundreds of parts, it almost has to be hand shaped. You know I'm kind of in a weird, there's not many people like me that actually do the design work and do the fabrication and welding. And that's really just because I wanted to do it. I'm not so sure there's a huge need for it, because there's certainly people that are experts in both. But you know, I always think there's going to be a role for anybody, for hand-produced, old-school ways of crafting things, because otherwise it'll get lost. And anytime something starts to fade away, somebody jumps in and starts producing some handcrafted, artisanal something, and they find a way to mass produce it, either with just sheer manpower or just thinking of some smarter way to do it.
When you did your first custom vehicle and it won an award, that's kind of rare for a first-time builder to have that happen and kind of strike twice, if you will. Do you have a sense that your previous design both learning but also practice at GM and whatnot had a role in how that worked out, or what other factors may have worked into that?
Yeah, you know, luckily with that little truck, you know, that again, I was working with some talented craftsmen that had already won awards before that. You know, it's really just my design input. You know, I only probably did 20% of the labor on that thing, and I'll say 80% of the design. But no, definitely, I felt pretty confident in my style, you know, at that point, and then trusting what I envisioned in my head, how it would look in 3 dimensions. You know, some of that comes through just, you know, experience. You know, some, I guess, is a talent-based thing. But no, definitely my time at GM made it. And almost every guy I know that was a corporate designer that comes out and does, you know, some SEMA project or an aftermarket, you know, something out of the corporate world, usually is pretty successful right off the bat. Just because taking some of the elements that you learn in working for a big car company, and in putting that into a, you know, basically a small-time hot rod project, it automatically just takes it to another level. You know, there's a lot of factors that, you know, proportions and things that you know, nobody really paid that much attention to, other than guys like Chip and Boyd Coddington, people that had experience with professionally trained designers. And so, you know, in that respect, really proportions is the key to making a cool vehicle, lines and proportions. The details are neat, you know, it's tricky, but you can still have a successfully, you know, design without all the tricky, fancy details. I mean, that just adds to it. But no, definitely having formal training and a few years under your belt, working with people that have been working in the industry for years, there's pretty much no way to beat that. Anybody else?
Can you, when you made that decision to take a year off to like build a bicycle when you were in your first motorcycle, was it, I mean, was it like a risk for you to make that decision?
Oh, well, all of this stuff is risks, you know. I mean, it was scary to quit my job, you know, what most people consider a dream job, and move to Wyoming. You know, it was scary to move to Detroit, for obvious reasons. You know, and the same thing, all these jumps I did, which, you know, I kind of just said I was more scared to not do things. Just like, well, if I don't do it, I never will. You know, I'm still single and young. I don't have any responsibilities wherever here, so I can move here and experience that place. There wasn't a huge risk with moving to Santa Rosa to build that first bike, because they had plenty of work for me to do there on their other projects, as well as the freelance work I was doing this at night at home, and so they kind of took a lot of the fear out of that. You know, I knew that I didn't have much to worry about.